On the 16th of September, 1992, a date now known in British financial history simply as Black Wednesday, the government of John Major was forced to withdraw the pound sterling from the European exchange rate mechanism after a single day of currency market trading had made continued membership economically indefensible. The British Treasury spent approximately £3.3 billion in a single day attempting to defend the pound's ERM floor, raising interest rates twice in the same afternoon in increasingly desperate attempts to attract capital inflows that never materialized. By the time the government announced withdrawal at 7:45 in the evening, it had expended reserves in a battle it had already lost, and one man's fund had made a profit estimated at approximately £1 billion. That man was George Soros. His quantum fund had identified a structural vulnerability in the British government's currency commitment and had constructed a trading position large enough to force the outcome that the mathematics of the situation already made inevitable. The trade that broke the Bank of England is the most famous single currency speculation in financial history, and it is instructive precisely because it was not reckless gambling. It was the application of careful analysis to a situation in which the government's stated policy was, in Soros's assessment, simply not sustainable. To understand what Soros did, you need to understand what the European exchange rate mechanism was and why Britain's membership in it had created the conditions that made the trade possible. The ERM was a system of managed currency exchange rates established in 1979 as a precursor to eventual European monetary union. Member countries committed to maintaining their currencies within specified bands relative to a central rate, which was itself anchored to the German Deutsche Mark. If a currency fell toward the bottom of its band, the member government was obligated to defend it, buying its own currency with foreign reserves, raising interest rates to attract capital inflows, or both. Britain joined the ERM in October of 1990 during the chancellorship of John Major, at a central rate of 2 Deutsche Marks and 95 Pfennigs to the pound. The decision to join at this rate was, in retrospect, a political judgment more than an economic one. Many economists had argued that the chosen rate overvalued the pound and would prove difficult to sustain. The argument for joining at that rate was that it would provide an anti-inflationary anchor and a commitment mechanism for maintaining sound monetary policy. The structural problem that emerged over the following 2 years was the divergence of economic conditions between Britain and Germany. The reunification of East and West Germany had created inflationary pressures in the German economy that prompted the Bundesbank to maintain high interest rates. High German rates meant that capital flowed into Deutsche Mark assets in preference to assets denominated in other European currencies, including the pound, which put downward pressure on those other currencies relative to the mark. Britain, meanwhile, was in recession. The economic policy response to recession would normally be to cut interest rates, reducing the cost of borrowing to stimulate investment and consumption. But cutting rates would have weakened the pound further relative to the Deutsche Mark, potentially pushing it below the ERM floor. The ERM commitment had locked Britain into German monetary policy at precisely the moment when British domestic conditions called for precisely the opposite policy. George Soros and his senior partner Stan Druckenmiller had been analyzing this situation through the summer of 1992. The analysis was not complicated. The conclusion was stark. A currency that is overvalued relative to economic fundamentals, held in a fixed exchange rate system, can be defended only as long as the defending government has enough foreign reserves to buy its own currency faster than the market can sell it, and as long as the domestic political costs of the interest rates required to attract capital are tolerable. Soros and Druckenmiller concluded that neither condition held for the pound. British foreign reserves were finite and significantly smaller than the potential selling pressure that currency markets could generate, and the interest rates that would be required to sustain the pound's ERM value. The Bank of England's own analysis suggested rates of 12 to 15% or higher might be necessary, were politically and economically untenable in a country already in recession, with mortgage rates that would follow base rates upward and with unemployment already high. The trade they constructed was a large short position in British pounds. To short a currency, You borrow it, sell it for another currency, in this case Deutsche Marks, and profit when the currency you shorted falls in value, allowing you to repurchase it cheaply and repay the loan. The profit is the difference between the price at which you sold and the price at which you repurchased. The position Quantum Fund eventually built reached approximately $10 billion in borrowed and sold pounds. This was an extraordinary quantity. Soros was committing to a trade whose notional size exceeded the fund's capital by a significant multiple. The leverage was possible because currency transactions can be conducted on margin, with relatively small capital supporting large notional positions. Other hedge funds and institutional investors, watching the same dynamics and reaching similar conclusions, were building their own short positions. The aggregate selling pressure on the pound in the weeks leading up to Black Wednesday was enormous. The events of Black Wednesday itself compressed the abstract dynamics of currency crises into a single day of extraordinary financial drama. The pound opened under pressure, trading near the bottom of its band. The Bank of England intervened heavily, buying pounds in large quantities. The scale of the bank's purchases was, in retrospect, inadequate to the selling pressure arrayed against it. Mid-morning, the British government announced an interest rate increase from 10% to 12%, a 2 percentage point emergency hike intended to signal commitment to the ERM and attract capital inflows. The announcement had no effect on the pound's exchange rate. The market's collective judgment was that the commitment was not credible. By midday, with the pound still at the floor of its ERM band, despite the rate increase and the bank's purchases, the government announced a second increase to 15%. This announcement was also ineffective. The markets had decided that the economic and political costs of 15% interest rates in recession-stricken Britain were simply not something any government could sustain. The higher the interest rate commitment, the clearer it became that it could not be maintained, and therefore the less effective it was as a commitment device. Throughout the day, Soros's fund and the other short sellers were continuing to sell. The Bank of England was running out of reserves to buy pounds with. At approximately 7:45 in the evening, Norman Lamont, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, appeared outside the Treasury to announce that Britain was suspending its membership in the ERM. The pound was allowed to float and immediately fell by roughly 15% against the Deutsche Mark in the days following. Quantum Fund closed its position. The profit on the trade was approximately £1 billion, a figure that captured the popular imagination and has defined how the episode is remembered. The consequences of Black Wednesday were layered and in some cases paradoxical. The immediate economic impact was, by most assessments, positive for Britain. The pound's devaluation made British exports more competitive. The freedom to set interest rates according to domestic conditions rather than German monetary policy allowed the Bank of England to cut rates, stimulating economic recovery. The British economy grew strongly in the years following ERM exit, performing significantly better than France and Germany, which remained in the ERM. The political consequences were catastrophic for the Conservative Party. John Major's government had staked its economic credibility on the ERM commitment, and that commitment had collapsed publicly and expensively. Opinion polls showed a collapse in conservative economic trustworthiness that never fully recovered. The party lost the 1997 election to Tony Blair's Labour Party in a landslide. For Soros, the trade produced something beyond the profit. It made him the most famous speculator in the world and transformed him from a successful fund manager into a figure of global cultural significance. It also produced a philosophical observation that he repeated in subsequent interviews. He had not broken the Bank of England in any literal sense. He had identified a situation in which the government's policy commitment was internally inconsistent with economic reality and had placed a bet on the outcome that the mathematics required. The Bank of England broke itself. He was just the largest person in the market who reached the correct conclusion first. The Black Wednesday episode is a case study in the limits of credibility as a substitute for fundamental economic coherence. Fixed exchange rate systems require participating governments to subordinate domestic monetary policy to the discipline of maintaining the peg. This can work well when economic conditions across the fixed-rate zone are similar enough that a common interest rate policy is appropriate for all of them. It fails when conditions diverge significantly and the required rate for the peg is fundamentally inconsistent with domestic economic needs. The lesson is not that fixed exchange rates are always wrong. It is that a commitment to maintain an overvalued exchange rate in the face of contractionary domestic conditions and politically intolerable interest rate requirements is not actually a commitment. It is a performance of commitment, and sophisticated market participants who identify the performance as such will trade against it. The British government spent £3.3 billion and raised rates to 15% in a single afternoon, attempting to sustain a position that the economic fundamentals had already determined was untenable. Soros' contribution was to accelerate the moment of reckoning, not to create it. £1 billion one Wednesday, and the mathematics of a commitment that was always going to break.